Welcome back, everybody, to the public meeting of the GSSB on the 17th of October, continued after a private session and lunch. I'm just going to hand straight over to Bastian Buck, our Chief Standards Officer, to run this session.
Thank you, Carol. Let me first welcome our guests from the TNFD, Tony Goldner and Alessandra, who have joined us today for a discussion on a project that we have recently been tabling with the GSSB, a project that would lead us to add a new line of work to the work program of GRI as GSSB, specifically to develop guidance on the link between impacts and risks and opportunities. The reason that we have included the TNFD colleagues in this discussion is the recent launch of the collective work of the TNFD of the last years, which has very important pointers on this subject matter, the link between the impacts and risks and opportunities. What I wanted to do is give a quick background on the discussions thus far for the benefit of our guests, but also to remind the GSSB members on what we have been talking about in the last GSSB meeting, and then invite an input presentation from the colleagues from the TNFD to explain their perspective on the link between impacts and risks and opportunities and how it manifests in the now public methodologies of the TNFD that will see widespread adoption, hopefully, across very many jurisdictions going forward. I should also mention in that context that we, from a technical perspective in GRI overall, has worked very closely with the colleagues at the TNFD in bringing about their work, in particular, of course, in the area of biodiversity and the link between our biodiversity standard and the framework issued by the TNFD. So there's been an ongoing relation there in collaboration to make sure that what we originate from GRI side moves in lockstep with the important work of the TNFD and vice versa. So I want to take 2 minutes just for quick reminder on where we stand with this project. I think over the last months, we have identified a need on the side of the practitioners, the people charged with reporting in corporates, the people advising corporates on reporting, but importantly also regulators to add context to the question how risks and opportunities, financial risks and opportunities relate to impacts and arise from impacts. We have acknowledged that demand for more guidance that is articulated in direct conversation with regulators and practitioners towards GI, but we know to many other players in the field as well. We've looked to advance a discussion with the colleagues at the IFRS, whether there would be space to actually develop this guidance jointly. As of now, the ISSB is not able to commit to this yet, but we will continue to invite the colleagues to join in because we believe that the strongest possible outcome and guidance would actually be provided by a number of collaborating partners. And I think in this context, we have invited today the TNFD colleagues because we see them as equally essential to this debate because they are really at the forefront of exploring that link for a specific issue area. For us, what we would envision to do as part of the project is to develop guidance eventually that is generic in nature and links the guidance that we already have on the impact materiality approach in the GRI standards to standards and regulatory efforts that have a financial materiality lens or a double materiality focus, and will need more input on impacts can actually translate and explain risks and opportunities. When it comes to format, I think that's a due process related note. We want to be relatively, for standard setter at least, relatively swift in terms of process and offer guidance to practitioners as soon as possible. We're proposing initially to work on non-authoritative guidance, meaning that we don't have to follow the due process protocol in full. We believe that there are certain elements of how we go about setting standards should also apply to how we go about setting or developing guidance. But non-authoritative guidance for us means that we don't have to go through all the motions of the due process protocol at this point in time. That will enable us again to be hopefully a little quicker with having first guidance publicly available. There's always the option to then bring projects back into the due process, formally approve a project proposal, and tick the box on the important characteristics that are outlined for expert participation and so on. And I should note at this point that we had a brief discussion in preparation of this session with Tony, also exploring how such an approach would resonate with the TNFD, and explicitly already mentioning that we are open to collaborate with the TNFD and hopefully, as I said, other players, so that there is a joint market response to this important demand. Without further ado, I would like to invite Tony to offer his reflections at this point, and later we have a moment of where we can ask questions to the TNFD colleagues, start a discussion on this subject matter, but also dive a bit deeper into how we, from a technical side, would envision a project to go down, in both in terms of its characteristics as well as the timeline. This as an input presentation. I'm looking around in the room whether there are any questions on that initial brief, and otherwise I would turn to Tony and Alessandra for the input presentation. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Bastian, and also to the whole board for this opportunity to meet with you. It's great to join this important discussion. As I'm sure you all know, the TNFD was launched in late 2021 with the support of the Sustainable Finance Working Group of the G20, and asked to deliver our recommendations in 2 years, which we've done on time. They were launched at the New York Stock Exchange on the 18th of September. And in addition to the disclosure recommendations, we've also released a significant package of additional guidance to help market participants get started in terms of responding to nature-related issues. So in a sense, there are really two components to where we're up to today with TNFD. The first is the disclosure recommendations. The second is this package of additional guidance. So I might just spend a minute or two outlining what's in each of those and our approach to some of the key issues that we've worked through over the last 2 years. And then I'll talk to what we've heard from the market about priorities going forward and where we'd like to collaborate with you and with the GRI team. So on the disclosure recommendations, we've published 14 disclosure recommendations, incorporating all 11 of the TCFD recommended disclosures on the climate side. And we did that very explicitly to build on where the market is today, to enable market participants to now broaden the aperture of their work on sustainability issues from a climate-only focus to now looking at the broader set of nature-related issues. Of course, in the science, climate is one of the 5 drivers of nature loss, and so essentially TNFD, recognizing the work of the TCFD on climate, has now expanded the set of considerations so that we can look at all 5 of those drivers, and we would very much advocate for an integrated approach to looking at impacts, risks, dependencies and opportunities across all of that integrated landscape of climate plus nature related issues. But we did build on all of the 11 TCFD disclosures. They've all been carried over into the TNFD nature context. And we identified 3 additional disclosures that we thought were particularly germane or important in the nature context. One relating to value chains, the second relating to stakeholder engagement, because of course, we don't live up in the atmosphere where the emissions are gathering. We live on terrestrial biomes of nature, and it's in very close proximity to local communities who need to be integral to the solution, including in particular Indigenous communities who are custodians of 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. So specific disclosure recommendation in relation to the quality and the way in which stakeholder engagement is undertaken. And the third additional disclosure is in relation to where a business is interfacing with particularly sensitive ecosystems, which we've called priority locations. And we've provided a set of definitional characteristics of priority locations. And that's important from a social impact perspective. We obviously all want to know where business is interfacing with parts of the world that are particularly fragile, but also from a business perspective, interface with those fragile ecosystems could mean elevated or enhanced risks to the enterprise. So 14 disclosures, 11 carried over from TCFD, 3 additional. To get market participants moving and to respond to the fact that nature is essentially a new topic for business related reporting, at least for most organizations we've spoken to, we published this additional set of guidance. And at the center of that is an assessment approach, really how-to guidance. We've called that the LEAP approach, an acronym for locate, evaluate, assess and prepare. And what we've done with that guidance is we've aligned the evaluate phase, evaluate dependencies and impacts, and assess risks and opportunities. And we use those 4 words very deliberately. So we talk about, aligned with GRI, we talk about impacts on nature, dependencies on nature, and we talk about risks to the enterprise or opportunities to the enterprise or to the organization. When we first started our work, it became very apparent that in the everyday discussion that business and finance were having about these issues, the words impacts and risks were often used interchangeably. People talking about risks to nature or impacts to an organization. So one of the things we've tried to be very clear is let's use those terms with a level of intention so that it's extremely clear what we're all referring to. So when we talk about impacts and dependencies, it's in relation to nature, risks and opportunities in relation to the organization. And I think all of us need to continue to reinforce the specific use of those 4 words. It's very consistent by most of us working in this field. TCFD use risks and opportunities in the enterprise. You've been using impacts in terms of impact on nature and climate. But I think there's still work to be done to make sure that the use of those basic building blocks of the approach is clear to market participants. We've also done everything we can to align with the language and the structure in the approach taken by the IFRS with the new S1 and S2 sustainability standards, but also the language and approach that you have used at GRI with the GRI standards. And so we were particularly happy to see on the day of our launch statements by both the ISSB and GRI signalling the consistency of our approach with the standards that you have and with the standards that have recently been published by the ISSB. We were delighted to see that because we were working really hard to make sure that that signal of consistency was there. And I'm sure there's areas where we can continue to improve alignment. And the market is looking for very clear guidance about how does TNFD's recommendations flow into the GRI standards or flow into the ISSB standards. And that's one of the key priorities that we'd like to work on in the next few months is this sort of alignment guidance. We'd be delighted to work with you all on that as well. The other thing that I think is really important to note is the approach to materiality. Now, the approach that the task force took is that we are a tool developer and we want that tool to be used by as many market participants as possible. And so we have built TNFD in a way that it works irrespective of the materiality notion or definition used in different jurisdictions. So we recognise that Europe has now taken a double materiality approach that's now in black and white regulation. Other jurisdictions, of course, had taken a different approach, anchored in the IFRS's definition of materiality. And so we set out to build the TNFD in a way that could be relevant in all of those contexts. And at our launch, I used the simple analogy of technology software, where we would often talk about whether an app works on the Apple Store or on the Android platform. And of course, many apps work on both. And that's a sort of simple analogy for the way in which we saw the TNFD approach. It's not our job to determine the materiality of report preparers. That's a conversation, obviously, that they have between their shareholders, their other stakeholders, their regulatory market, and of course, their own vision and value as an organisation. So we've set about enabling the materiality requirements and preferences of the report preparers, and I think that's been generally well understood now. Let me just finish with a couple of thoughts about sort of key priorities for us going forward, picking up on Bastian's comments. There are two things that we were very focused on in the short term. The first is this sort of alignment guidance around how does TNFD work in the context now of, say, CSRD in the European Union context, but also alignment with other existing or emerging regulation and standards. Of course, in countries like India, there's the BRSR framework, and there are other countries where there are existing reporting requirements that touch on some of the aspects that we've covered at the TNFD. So there are calls from market participants for that kind of guidance, and we'd be delighted to work with you and the ISSB and others in clarifying how the TNFD recommendations at the recommendations level flow down or fit into consistent with the standards that you and the ISSB are developing. So that's the first thing we're keen to do going forward. The second thing is around impact materiality assessment, and this was mentioned by Bastian. I mentioned that we have developed this implementation guidance we call LEAP. That has been in development for 2 years. We've done this in a very open, iterative way with market participants, and we've had the enormous benefit of having over 200 institutions pilot test that application of that guidance. And so it's very much been developed with the market, for the market. And the feedback from the pilot testing has been incredible. We've learned a huge amount, and we've adapted that guidance as we've gone. One of the things that came out of that guidance is we want the TNFD guidance to help us meet the impact materiality requirements now in the CSRD guidance or requirements in the ESRS. And we also wanted to help us understand the materiality threshold under the IFRS standards. So we customized the guidance to essentially meet those two materiality tests. And we're expecting a lot more pilot testing of this as the months and the next few years go on. But I think one of the things we learned is that particularly on the impact materiality side, not least, I guess, coming out of Europe with their new reporting requirements, we looked at all of the additional existing guidance around about how do you do impact assessment, impact materiality assessment. And our view was that it was still quite conceptual in nature. And there's an opportunity to move beyond sort of conceptual guidance to really something that's much more practically grounded. And I think there's an opportunity for more case studies and just making the process feel more accessible to market participants. And this is certainly what we heard through pilot testing. So as Bastian suggested, I think there's an opportunity to push this impact materiality assessment guidance further forward. We've done our best to summarise what we found that's out there and incorporate that into what we've just released, but we're very interested in moving this further forward. And as Bastian suggested, I think this could be an area where we would be very happy to collaborate with you and with others so that we can give market participants the most practical guidance possible in how to satisfy their impact materiality requirements. And of course, with CSRD now coming into effect, this is a very pressing and timely requirement, particularly for all those companies that need to report against the CSRD. So I'll conclude just by saying thank you again for all of the amazing collaboration we've had with the GRI team over the last 2 years. We've certainly done everything we can to signal that we're aligning to your work as it stands today and as you plan to evolve it further in the next couple of years. And we look forward to further collaboration, and one of those areas of further collaboration could be specifically around this impact materiality assessment that I think the market's looking for more practical guidance on. So let me stop there. Very happy to take any comments or questions from the group.
Questions from the group here. I think I want to acknowledge that this collaboration that we started 2 years ago. This is what happened here in terms of developing your mandate and you given access to your processes. Also acknowledging a parallel process that is taking and related process that is taking place on our side. I use that in public speaking and engagement with regulatory parties and others as an example for how we from the GSB side would like to work going forward. There will always be a situation that things evolve in parallel, but if we can do that in the way we have approached it collectively in the past 2 years, then we actually land at different points in time with outputs that are calibrated to the extent possible. And I think in terms of reporting burden, but also in terms of clarity of what's available in the landscape, that is absolutely essential going forward. So if we can build on that together by offering now more guidance when on our side, biodiversity standards is available a little later than your work becoming publicly available, and that's an excellent next step. Just wanted to offer that reflection to get us started here. I'm inviting comments and questions from the members now that we have the benefit of Tony and Alessandra being with us. Is there anything that you would like to raise, questions you might have? Carol.
It's great to hear of this collaboration. Thank you very much, Tony, for that presentation. Really glad to hear that it's been a fruitful collaboration. Can you explain in a bit more detail this process of going from the impacts to the risks and opportunities?
Sure. Well, I think the starting foundation of the TNFD's approach is that you can't understand risks and opportunities without having an understanding of your impacts and dependencies on nature. That's sort of foundational premise of the TNFD's approach, and we've outlined that in what we call the general requirements section of the guidance that we put forward. So we think it really starts with understanding dependencies and impacts on nature, and I'd highlight both words, dependencies and impacts, because probably the new word in the language around nature is this word dependencies. We haven't typically had a discussion around our dependence on the atmosphere. We all talk about the impact on the atmosphere through emissions, but we haven't really had a discussion about dependencies on the atmosphere. But this notion of dependency on terrestrial, marine and freshwater biomes of nature is absolutely essential. And dependencies and impacts are obviously codependent. Your impact today can amplify your dependencies on the same ecosystem tomorrow. A good example being, for example, a beverage company. If it withdraws too much water today, it not only has a negative impact, or maybe having a negative, unsustainable impact on the local ecosystem or the watershed in which it's operating, but that withdrawal of water may in fact amplify its own dependencies in that ecosystem going forward. And dependency is really the pathway through to the risk to the enterprise. And so we think it's critical to understand dependencies and impacts you can't understand one without having a good understanding of the other. So that's really the foundation. Having understood impacts and dependencies, that's really then the pathways I said before to understanding risks and then identifying potential opportunities. So for us, it's really about being clear about the analytic process, the assessment process, in order to understand risks of the enterprise, being grounded in an understanding of dependencies and impacts on nature. And that's what we've laid out in the LEAP guidance in quite significant detail, and where we've pulled through the existing impact materiality assessment guidance that's available, looking at issues around severity, around significance, thinking about issues around thresholds. And of course, some of that is still very much evolving in the science. One of the questions we've had a lot asked over the last 2 years is around, well, how do we know what the state of nature is in a particular location and what the carrying capacity or the thresholds of that particular location are in terms of its ability to support, for example, the withdrawal of a certain amount of water. And a lot of the science is still evolving. We don't have a clear set of state of nature measures globally around the world. Even some of the units of measurement are still in debate. We don't have a clear set of thresholds around every location, every ecosystem on the planet in terms of what its carrying capacity is. So this is part of the challenge of this guidance to companies and financial institutions, is that we need them to act, we need them to be thinking along these lines, but in a world in which there's imperfect information, there might be data gaps. And so a big focus of the task force has been helping people to start to assess and frame up these issues, even qualitatively, if there are particular data issues at the moment. But it really does all start with understanding impacts and dependencies on nature in the process that we've outlined.
Thank you very much.
Julia.
Sorry, I have only a question in order to guarantee the coherence with the CSRD of this kind of guidelines. I think that this kind of guidelines is perfect, and it will be really a support for the companies to put in place the materiality assessment. Also because the part of TNFD is the most challenge that we have, because you have another level of detail respect to the rest, because the LEAP process is something new. It's not something new, but it's something new related to the materiality assessment. But I am only a little bit scared of the timing of the guidelines, because we know that EFRAG this morning published another version of the guideline on double materiality. Probably by the end of the year, you will have the public consultation of this kind of guidelines by EFRAG in order to have the final document at the beginning of 2024. The companies have to start with the materiality at the beginning of 2024, and so they will start to design this kind of process. If this kind of guidelines will arrive at the end of 2024, it's possible that we haven't the opportunity inside the company to integrate your guidelines, because if you have designed the process in the first half of the 2024, if we don't have also this kind of guidelines, I think that in Europe, not in the rest of the world, but in Europe, we can lose something. I don't know if you have aligned, because if I read the documents that I have, the idea, the deadline is the end of 2024. I don't know if it's possible to have two release of this kind of document in order to be sure that the company won't start with this kind of guidelines.
Yeah, thank you. Well, let me just, I probably should have clarified this before, but let me just clarify that what we've said is that the disclosure recommendations, the 14 disclosure recommendations, are fixed, and the task force has no plans to change those 14 disclosure recommendations. So you can think of those as akin to the 11 TCFD disclosure recommendations published in 2017. So from a disclosure perspective, what we're proposing, or what we're recommending that companies should include in their annual reporting package, those disclosure recommendations are not likely to change. At least we have no current intentions to change them. The supporting implementation guidance that I mentioned, the good news is we have said that that will be adapted and updated over time as new science evolves, as the standards landscape evolves. So with respect to the implementation guidance that I think you were referring to in that question, we've always signaled that that would be dynamic, that it would evolve. We will issue new releases of that guidance to help market participants in the future as both the science evolves, as the data landscape improves, as new things become possible, and obviously as the standards landscape evolves. So I think we have from a TNFD perspective, we have the flexibility to work with you, and as new guidance from EFRAG and others emerges, we can update that guidance over the course of the next 6, 12, 18 months, 2 years as we move forward. So from our perspective, that's not a huge challenge, but we would obviously will be following the events. This is going to be part of Alessandra's work going forward. She spent a huge amount of time poring through the ISSB standards, the GRI standards, the EFRAG guidance. So this is fully what we expect to happen going forward, that the landscape will continue to evolve, and we're fully ready to issue updated versions of our implementation guidance to reflect those changes as and when they happen.
Thank you, Tony. I think what I would like to offer in addition is an observation that we have an opportunity here with the colleagues from the TNFD to work specifically on the nature biodiversity nexus. They've done extensive work in this space of materiality and the connection of impacts and risks and opportunities already. We will issue the biodiversity standard, and on the back of it, there is probably a joint platform to offer guidance specifically on this subject matter in a first step, building on the case studies that have been part of the TNFD process. And when we look at the more generic guidance that we're offering on materiality, that is probably more difficult a project, and it requires more consideration. And maybe that is then a second output that we could look to. The other point that I would make is by making things public, even if only for consultation, I think we are already making guidance available to the market. And I think as soon as you move out of standard setting under due process, that is certainly an opportunity that we haven't leveraged as much as we could in the past. With standard setting, we are always very clear about disclaimers that standards that are for consultation shouldn't be used or shouldn't be understood to be the final version of something. With the guidance, I think we're in a slightly different space, and to inform market practice, if that is our collective objective, and then that is something we could look to induce also through a public consultation process, much like the colleagues at EFRAG are actually doing with issuing various versions of it before they actually go through a public consultation, and knowing that there will still be more work after the formal public consultation.
If I can just add to that, Bastian, I think there are two points that I think I'd just add to that. One is, and I was clear in my comments before that we're very deliberate in the way we use particular words: dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities as the sort of 4 building blocks of the TNFD approach. I think that the 2 other words we use quite deliberately are nature and biodiversity. And I think there's work to be done in terms of making sure market participants understand the difference between those 2 terms. I would say over the last 2 years in our work, particularly in Europe, there's often interchangeable use of the words nature and biodiversity, but in the science they have very particular meanings. So I think as the market level of engagement in this topic scales, and as people start to look at these from an assessment perspective and a risk and opportunity management and impact perspective, it's going to be increasingly important that we're using those 2 words quite deliberately, and they do mean different things. So I would just add that one thing I think we can and we would be happy to work on is being quite specific when we're talking about nature and when we're talking about biodiversity as a characteristic of nature, because I think that clarity will also help the market. The other thing as we think about standards going forward is whether there's an approach that treats nature in an integrated way or whether it disaggregates it into different thematic sort of subtopics. As you can tell from the TNFD approach, we've taken an integrated approach, and we would very much advocate for market participants to be thinking about nature in an integrated way, including climate and climate change as part of the broad construct of nature and sustainability issues. But of course, others have disaggregated the notion of nature into different subtopics, notably the EFRAG ESRS, which now has several topics. So I think one of the other issues that we have to think about as we move forward in this space is the design of the process and the way in which the standards and the guidance are laid out to market participants. We would advocate for an integrated approach, and that obviously means building the capability in the market to think integratively about all of the different aspects of nature. EFRAG and perhaps some others have broken it into subtopics, and so we need to think about what are the pros and cons of those different approaches, because the risk of disaggregating is you might end up with blind spots in terms of the connectivity of one subtopic connecting over to another, and does that actually then result in blind spots in terms of the information that's reported.
Thank you, Tony, for this reflection. We were actually on a similar point with the board earlier today, where we were looking at labor-related standards and questioning whether there is a certain grouping of subject matters that is advisable, or whether you keep them separate. But what's needed in any case is to point to the connections between different topic discussions and look at it more holistically. I think that there is agreement in the board about that. We have one more question here from Joseph.
Yeah, so thank you, Tony, for that insightful discussions. One question is, when we get into this assessment, the LEAP assessment, the complexity of the process, depending on what topic we are talking about, identifying the impact pathways, assessing how much is the magnitude of that impact, looking at the size of the organization, how much that will impact, and then come out with a kind of risk measurement of what is the probability of that impact and what is the severity of that impact. Now, that entire process is actually very, very effort-driven. And what we've seen is, most of the clients we work with, when you get into that process, because of the cost, they try to deprioritize it. So do you have any simplification solution or some digitization part which we can help clients to have much more reduced efforts in terms of the cost?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I guess we're all very conscious of complexity and cost to comply. I think, Joseph, one of the things that I've picked up in conversations with our pilot testers, and I mentioned over 200 organizations have pilot tested this approach, is many felt daunted at the beginning, but once they got started, they actually felt it was much more accessible and doable than they first imagined. So that's why in our messaging now, after our launch of our recommendations, we're encouraging people to get started, use the data, use the analysis that you have. Quite often, companies have also found they've got a lot of information internally, maybe in the environment department, that the risk department has never even had a reason to ask for before. So we've also heard amazing stories of organizations that have just discovered that they've got huge amounts of information in one part of the organization that another part of the organization didn't know about. So I think that's one thing, which is just encouraging people to get started using what they've got. We've heard many stories of people making a lot more progress than they initially imagined, and that this actually isn't as complex and daunting as they imagined at first. The other thing is, I think when we talk about measuring severity and magnitude and scale of impact and things, many of those principles are exist within standard risk management practices today, as you know. And for example, companies are doing this in relation to things like cyber risk, which in a funny way has some similar characteristics to nature risk. If I take you back to the Dasgupta review published by the UK government 2 years ago, Professor Dasgupta said that nature typically operates in ways that are silent, invisible, and mobile. And he had these sort of three characteristics. And if you think about it, cyber risk from an organizational perspective actually shares those same characteristics. It's silent, in most cases it's invisible, and it's mobile. You don't know where it's going to come from and how it might impact the organization. And yet what we've seen in the last 5 years in particular is companies making huge investments in their cyber risk resilience and their ability to assess and manage their cyber risk. So I think we should be looking at ways in which we can leverage their experience in a domain like cyber and think about how do we then apply some of those tools and techniques for risk assessment across into other domains like nature. So I know that's not a very precise answer to your question, but I think there are some lessons learned from other domains. And I think it's about bringing it back as much as we can to core and existing risk management practices, because of course those are familiar and well known to market participants. And if we can present these new risks in a way that builds on existing procedures and practices and methods, then I think that's probably the way through the complexity.
Thank you, Tony. I'm looking here at colleagues in the room. Jeff, you.
Thank you, Tony. Just following on from your comment about the road testers, for the benefit of the folks here, perhaps including myself, who haven't reviewed the findings from those road tests in detail, what were some of the key insights that came out of the road testing process, or any other neat kind of findings from that process that you think would be germane to this group?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think there are a couple of key insights that I'll play back to you. The first is that if we think about the 4 phases of the LEAP approach, starting with to locate your interface with nature, of course that was the most unfamiliar new component for most organizations. Once it gets to assessing risks and opportunities, organizations do that every day of the week in other aspects of their work, and then they know how to plan and respond once risks are managed. So the second half of the LEAP approach, the A and the P, were fairly familiar. Most of the hard work and the unfamiliar territory was in the L and the E. And so with the L, it was really about how do we take the sort of the science of nature and bring that into the conversation in the organization, so we can map it against where our assets are located. You know, obviously if you're an asset heavy business like a forestry business or something, it's very obvious where you touch nature, and you may in fact have a lot of information about the state of nature in those locations. But a lot of businesses said, you know, it's a lot of work for us just to assemble even our asset level data as an organization as a starting point. So that was a bit of a surprise, frankly, to us, that companies would have to go through a lot of work to assess their asset level data, but obviously it depends on the business model and the sector. So that was a key insight, is, you know, most companies, in order to assess their nature risk, are going to have to organize their asset level data internally as a starting point. The second thing is just navigating and knowing where the data on the state of nature is. And we've done a lot of work, I think, to signpost to different data sets that companies can now use. But that was seen as very unfamiliar and new. And so we've done everything we can to kind of point people in the right places, and we're going to continue to find ways to make the locate stage easier to do. In fact, we're hoping to have some announcements on that in the next couple of months around sort of additional data sets or tools that can help do that faster at lower cost. And then I think on the evaluate side, there was this new notion of dependencies. So, okay, how do I think about my dependencies? What does that look like? What does dependency analysis mean? It's not a question that most companies had asked themselves before. How are we dependent on nature? And I think for those who went through the evaluate process, they really found it quite revealing using a simple taxonomy of ecosystem services to understand and to start to understand which of the ecosystem services do we have some first order or second order dependence on as a business. There might be some very obvious ones like water supply, but how dependent is our business on pollination as a service from nature into, say, food production that's part of our product and service offering? So yeah, I think there was a lot of learnings around dependencies and trying to understand dependencies. And then I think the third thing was the one we discussed before, which is how do we assess potentially material impacts using the definitions that are available, using the guidance that's now out from CSRD, material to who, how do we assess the magnitude and the severity? And again, we try to incorporate and leverage the guidance that's already there from you and others. And I think the feedback that came back was it's still quite conceptual. And so there's an opportunity to make that more practical. And people obviously love case study examples. So we've incorporated into our guidance, how does an asset manager, for example, understand their potential contribution to illegal deforestation? And there's some really interesting examples of how people went through an impact assessment process to try and answer that kind of question. So I would highlight those as probably the sort of 2 or 3 really significant areas of feedback, and that's why we're very keen to focus in on this point around impact materiality assessment, because I think there's obviously a pressing need now with CSRD ahead. And there's a lot of people asking for more practical guidance on how to do that well.
Great. Thanks, Tony.
Thanks a lot, Tony. What I want to do now is I want to offer up some comments from the standards division side about how the project could unfold. If we can go back to the slides. And you should be able to see them as well, Tony and Alessandra. And that's how we think, I think, importantly, I don't know where I have to point to, was the...
Anywhere.
Yeah? No. Okay. How we think about a project that would bring about generic guidance, so that is a connecting piece to the materiality guidance we offer in the GRI 3. And as I said earlier, that would not necessarily, or probably in a first instance, not follow due process in full. Where we are, after a discussion in September, we said we would go out, seek to speak to experts that have either developed their own approaches or have contributed to the debate in a significant way. As you can see today, we've definitely singled out the colleagues at the TNFD as a core party in this debate that we want to collaborate with directly. We are working towards a project proposal that will probably take a slightly different format from our usual project proposals for standard setting projects, but we want to give you an outline of how we see that generic guidance development unfolding. We believe that we have the capacity, if we prioritize right, to run this project as a GRI project, so that we are the conveners for this, with modalities to be decided with collaborating partners on how we publicly represent the project. It is important for us that in the end we offer a connecting piece specifically for the GRI standards, but we would of course understand if others join in, that they have similar objectives related to their own offering and frameworks and standards and so on. We want this to be standards agnostic in the sense that we see, to Tony's point, very many different developments globally. And we want to amplify the messaging around GI being the backbone of a lot of the reporting activity, holistically for sustainable development and impacts, and being able to respond to different developments through using the GI standards as this backbone. So we would, while we can certainly be specific about connections into developments like the TNFD, ISB, and so on, if we have the relevant parties collaborating in the project. We would also want to have this available as something that we can base discussions on with regulators that have aspirations to develop financial materiality focused sustainability regulation, or for that matter, have already embarked on the process, so that we have a connecting piece. Again, we're not envisioning to follow due process fully, so I think the element that usually takes quite some time and is to look at a formal TC or working group formation process through a public call and so on. We would probably skip that step and bank on the fact that we can leverage our network, our collective networks, to find the right people more quickly and get started. And we would, based on our experience, advise to keep a core expert group relatively small to advance this, because otherwise scheduling and everything gets in the way. But have a larger group of expert reviewers involved in the process, because there are many that take a keen interest in this discussion, but they're not necessarily the ones that can allocate a significant number of days within a 6 months time horizon or so. If we move to the next slide, then I want to offer. Oh, can I do this actually? Okay. In terms of this is the generic guidance. So if we commence the project in the first quarter next year, we would look at draft development in the second quarter and a public exposure in the third quarter. I don't think, given our resources, we can be much quicker than that. So I also want to manage expectations, as I shared earlier today. We have new colleagues joining the standards division. We have more capacity than ever before, but then again, all people are very busy already. And doing something like this, of this significance, also means reprioritizing, and that's a discussion we still have to have with the board. What I would also like to say, and now that we have the colleagues of the TNFD joining us today, this wouldn't preclude us from actually moving more quickly on guidance, specifically in the nature biodiversity space. So to offer up something that has relevance to those that are looking at the TNFD work and GI's work for the biodiversity standards, trying to make sense of it. There is already an ongoing discussion, and there's a lot that we could connect into. So building out case studies, maybe reflecting on the journey of GI reporters vis-a-vis the application of the TNFD, and offering more guidance, or just reflecting on practice as it is relevant to a broader set of preparers. That could definitely be an intermediate step and could build towards the broader objective that we have with the project, but is more realistic maybe for the first quarters of the next year already. So that is something that we from the GI side would like to advance in terms of discussion with the colleagues at the TNFD, also in light of discussions that are already ongoing in relation to the launch moments and these linkage pieces that we need to establish as part of putting out the biodiversity standard in context of the TNFD development. But yeah, broad lines, I just want to manage expectation about when we say quicker, what quick means in our context. Because in the end, even if it is non-authoritative guidance, I think there are high expectations for this to hold together and to be truly helpful to practitioners. And it is somewhat uncharted territory when it comes to generic guidance. And we want to take the time to fulfill this in the right way, rather than being quick to the market and then having to basically, after a public consultation, concede to the fact that we have to start from scratch again. So ideally, we go out with something that has the rigor that we would expect for the final product as well. These are the observations from the standards division on this project. And again, it would be part of the debate for this meeting and also the November meeting on how to reframe our work program for 2024. Just looking to the colleagues here in the room, are there any questions about the additional commentary? Oh, yeah, sorry.
Not the questions, but if emphasizing because biodiversity, nature, from a business point of view, the term called no net harm, So we at GRI or TNFT together should make the job easier to define what does it mean of no net harm, because many organizations globally setting the long-term targets of no net harm by 2040 and 2050. And it's a very qualitative statement as on date. So maybe moving forward together, we can help the organizations to get guidance from our standards or TNFT. What does it mean really for a stakeholder who wanted to understand in a simplest manner that, okay, no net harm means what, Because that's a buzzword in the space of nature and biodiversity.
Thank you. That's certainly something we can also consider when we develop more contents as part of the launch. Tony, please.
Thanks, Bastian. Just in relation to your timeline and process here, just a couple of thoughts. We're very happy to support this. And as you think about the draft development and the exposure process somewhere around there, if you're interested, we are happy to encourage our pilot testing community to pilot test something that comes out of your work, if that's a helpful contribution we can make as TNFD. The second thing we can contribute to this effort is case studies. We are going to be expanding our work on telling or presenting case studies about nature-related risks, what happens when they materialize, case studies about different risks from different ecosystem services, etc. So I'm very happy to support this, and there's probably a few things where we could make a practical, tangible contribution. On the question that was just, or the comment that was just made about no net harm, I agree there's a number of concepts like that that are around at the moment that are not well defined or well understood. The other one is the notion of nature positive. And so we have been looking for clarity on these terms, and we're very happy and very keen to see more clarity on what some of these terms mean. Net biodiversity gain is another. I'd simply note that there is now a nature positive initiative that has been formed with a number of organisations. In fact, TNFD and GRI are both participating, and that initiative is designed to try and drive some clarity into the notion of nature positive. And certainly from a TNFD perspective, what we have said, just to be clear, is we think negative impacts and positive impacts need to be measured and reported separately. We have not actually included any net reporting metrics in our recommendations to date. We know there's a lot of interest in notions of netting off negatives and positives. But from a TNFD perspective, we've been very clear that we think negative impacts and positive impacts should be measured and reported separately. And then if they end up getting aggregated into some metrics being developed or yet to be developed, we can get to that as those metrics come along. But at the moment, our point is quite clear that we should be measuring and assessing both negative and positive impacts separately.
Thank you, Tony. Just on that last point, I think that clearly resonates with our approach, and it's really good to see that this distinction, encouraging both the reporting of negative and positive impact, but keeping them separate, so that transparency is induced, also the understanding is induced how business models contribute. And in both negative and positive ways. That's essential for our reporting exercise as well. Joseph, you had one more question, and then I would like also looking at time to, and Carol, and then I would like to conclude this session in a moment.
Sorry, one more question, Tony. When you did this methodology, have you ever looked at the impact-weighted accounts methodology by Harvard University? And what is the applicability of that into this methodology?
We did, Joseph. We're aware of the work of the impact-weighted accounts initiative team out of Harvard. I think that's an area where we can continue to explore the potential leveraging of some of the reporting metrics that they are coming up with. I think it's an interesting piece of work. And so what we've said on the metrics side is that we've recommended a set of metrics for reporting, dependencies and impact metrics, as well as risk and opportunity metrics. We're looking forward to further feedback on those metrics and also learning from the initial market application of those metrics. And so I think the whole metrics landscape is something that's going to continue to evolve in the future. We're also aware that lots of people are working on aggregate footprint metrics, mean species abundance, PDF, ecosystem integrity index. There's lots of different efforts underway to develop these sorts of aggregated reporting indices and metrics. We didn't want to be picking any winners in that space. We think further innovation is really important. So whether it's impact-weighted accounts metrics or some of these footprint measures, we're looking forward to seeing further innovation happen. And we'll be watching as these are getting more tested, see which ones get further market feedback, which ones are perceived to be decision useful to investors and other stakeholders. And then again, we can update our guidance in that respect as we go forward.
Thank you, Tony. Karen.
So it's great to see all the work that's been done on this between our now and our September meeting, because it was only at the September meeting where we agreed to do this. So thank you all very much for prioritizing this and getting this far with the thinking. I have a question. Are you suggesting we either focus on looking at this in terms of just nature first or general? Is that what you're asking?
No, I think what we're saying is the generic guidance will take longer than something that can be a worked example or in a space where we know there will be an immediate demand with the launch of the biodiversity standard. And I think extrapolating some of the learnings from the process that the colleagues at the TNFD went through that can inform the wider generic guidance, that's something that we would be advising. But what we've seen also with the development of the GRI3 is the moment a lot of that development was informed by the work that happened in the human rights and UN space, and then it got basically transposed into the wider materiality assessment, and that was a difficult piece of work, and it took some time. And we anticipate that a similar thing is happening here. When you talk about all the risks and opportunities and the connection to all the impacts that arise from corporate activity, then there are a couple of, I think, discussions that still need to happen that nobody had really structurally. And so this will take more time. But for the nature biodiversity space, we have now a lot of attention already and a lot of practice that has been documented, and so maybe it's a stepping stone towards the other thing. That's what we are suggesting.
Well, I would have thought they might be done in parallel.
They will. I think they can be done in parallel, but the generic piece will take a lot longer. From our perspective, I don't say, having reviewed what has been suggested by the members and what we also looked up in terms of additional materials that are available. To be really helpful, we need to do more than what exists in the market right now, and so that will take significant time to develop. I mean, if you look at the GIS3 process, that was closer to 2 years of work eventually to form our opinions about that. We can bring that back. I mean, here we're looking at a draft development of 3 to 6 months, and that's probably as far as we can stretch it at the moment. Of course, you can be even more quick, but we have commitments across a range of projects right now, and if we want to apply even more resource to it, that means stopping running projects, and that's something we discussed at the standards division, that we're just not comfortable because we have made commitments to experts that are involved in the other processes, and we've committed to timelines with them.
Okay, I mean, I appreciate the experience so that you know how this was done in the past, but I had just seen it as an extra couple of steps on the GRI 3, taking that prioritized list of significant impacts and putting it, I don't know, into an enterprise risk management system, thinking about dependencies affected and so on. And I would have thought you had to make sure that any generic approach and an approach that might be specific to a particular impact were aligned. So it may not be as, maybe it's not as complicated as...
Let's hope. I mean, we can always surprise ourselves with these projects. But it is. I think we should also acknowledge that we're going to enter a space that is highly codified with risk management approaches that exist, COSO and other things. There's a profession that has been at this for very many years.
Yeah.
And we need to make sure that whatever we do actually connects. Also in light of discussions we had earlier, it needs to connect to existing practice to be useful, and to have these discussions, to find the right people. I think there is certainly interest for it, but it will take some time, unfortunately. Yeah. So I think we have another opportunity tomorrow and also in November to discuss prioritization, and we can certainly look at what it means to give even more resource to this particular project, because it is highly strategic and important, and there's clearly a demand. But even with all the resources in the world, I think these things usually surprise us in terms of complexity. That's just the reality of it. If there are no further questions at this point, then I would like to take the opportunity to thank the colleagues from the TNFD. First of all, again, for the collaboration up to this point, but also we will take you up on the offer, Tony, that you've made, that there are immediate connecting elements in your agenda and what we are describing today. So we will continue this collaboration. We will reach out and we'll make sure that we involve you directly in how we plan this larger project, but specifically also building towards the launch of our biodiversity standard and then joint outreach activity, so that we make sure that we can demonstrate also to preparers that we've invested the right amount of time in bringing about our collective work, and that we have thought about linkages and all of that. So thanks again for taking the time today. Really, really helpful, and we look forward to work with you and colleagues in the near future.
Thanks, Bastian. All the best for the rest of your meeting. Bye-bye.
And we will now take a break and come back at 2:30 European time for another public session. Thank you.